All right, good evening, everybody. It's Jason Mills coming to you from inside the indoor studio here. We're going over the rules of golf. Title is Rules of Golf for Those Who Know Enough to Be Dangerous. It's just a humorous title, but really the gist of it is we want to go over what we think are some big concepts within the rules that people either misunderstand or there's just a lot of different interpretations going around. And we've got about 10 things that we're going to go over tonight and hopefully walk away feeling like you learned something, but also that you're better equipped when you get on the golf course to know how to proceed. For those of you that have done these webinars with us before, we have someone on standby for technical support. So tonight that's Andrew Francis. If you're having issues with the Zoom call at all, his email is afrancis@ccclub.org. That's afrancis@ccclub.org if you're having any issues. And then Chris Nieto is on hand for questions. So if you have questions related to the seminar as we're going through it, please text them. I'll give you a second here. I'm going to read out the number, 831-596-7410. Once again, for questions, please text them to 831-596-7410. What tends to happen with rule seminars is there's some questions that are very specific to something that's maybe happened to you on the golf course or something that's happened to one of your friends, and the explanation can get a little bit long. If you have something that pops up that kind of fits that description that's very specific, we might not answer it on the seminar just because it might get a little confusing to folks that don't have the context of the situation, but we'll be sure to answer them offline once we finish things up. So with that, we will get into the seminar here. So I mentioned briefly what the title means, but the three goals we have tonight. Goal number one, just explore concepts within the rules that have common misconceptions. What tends to happen is people learn the rules through other people. And so you get this game of telephone that happens where the interpretation of the way the rules work tends to kind of morph with each telling of the rules. So we're going to try and dispel some of that. I'm also going to discuss some of the major changes that were established in 2019. So the rules of golf changed really dramatically as of January 1st of last year. And we're going to get into some of those bigger topics. And then last, we want to equip you with enough information to navigate the rules book. We have no illusions that you're going to walk away as a complete rules expert, but hopefully you feel a little more comfortable to be able to go through the rules, understand some of the terminology, which is really important, and feel better equipped when you get on the golf course. Now, I mentioned terminology. There's a section of the rules book called the definitions, and the definitions are really the skeleton of the rule book. And they're very, very specific terms. One of them here on this slide, parts of the course, that tell us a lot more about what they are than the rules themselves would indicate. So great example here, there's four distinct defined parts of the course. One is the teeing area, bunkers, penalty areas, and the putting green. Now all four of these areas, the rules, there's certain aspects of the rules that apply specifically to these areas. Now, if the rules said that every time they mention these terms, the rule book would be many times longer. So in order to condense the actual description of the rules, the definitions really guide us through that. So I'll just take you through briefly the four areas here. The teeing area, you can see on the diagram there, number one, that is the specific area where you start play of the hole. And the teeing area only applies to the hole being played. So the teeing area on a different hole is actually just part of the golf course. It doesn't have that status as the teeing area unless it's part of the specific hole being played. Number two is bunkers. We're all familiar with these, sand traps, also they're called. Number 3 is penalty areas. Now, penalty areas is a fairly new term. This was with part of a lot of the changes that came through in January 1st of 2019. We eliminated water hazards, and they've been replaced with penalty areas. The reason for the change was to allow the people setting up golf courses, so it's your tournament committee, your golf professional, the USGA, when they're setting up for their majors, it allows them to mark areas that are not necessarily related to water, but are not areas that people really would want to play out of or able to play out of. So you can see on the top part of this diagram here, that red circle around those trees. In the past, if it was under the water hazard definition, we wouldn't have been able to mark that anything because there's no water source there. And if you hit your ball in there and you couldn't find it, you had to go back to the tee. It was out of bounds, lost ball, and you're kind of out of luck. So expanding that definition to allow committees to designate areas that are not necessarily water related, but places that you really don't have a good chance of finding your ball or are tough to play from. They can mark that as a penalty area. And now instead of having to go back to the tee, you now have additional options there. And then the last area is the putting green. And similar to the teeing area, the putting green is only the putting green on the hole being played. If you're on a putting green on a different hole, it's actually called a wrong putting green, and you must take relief from it. So you're not able to, even if you only have a small shot, you must take the ball off the putting green and play your next shot from there. It's free relief, but that's one instance in the rules where you don't have the option to play the ball as it lies. You must take relief. All right, getting into our first concept where there's definitely some misconceptions, and that is the concept of accidentally moving your ball. So before we talk about the accidental movement, let's talk about the definition of a ball moving. So the definition, and I'm just going to read it straight from the book. When a ball at rest has left its original spot and comes to rest on any other spot, and this can be seen by the naked eye. The reason that term is in there is they didn't used to have it in there, and players on the PGA Tour were getting penalized for their ball moving when it was only able to be determined that it moved with a high definition, high speed camera. And that's really not fair, especially since some players spend more time under camera coverage than others. And so they added the naked eye portion in there so that if the human element can't determine that it moved, it didn't move. This applies to whether the ball has gone up, down, or horizontal in any direction away from its original spot. If the ball only wobbles, so or another terminology for that is oscillating, if it stays on or returns to its original spot, the ball is not deemed to move. So if the ball shifts from the spot it's lying and then drops back into that same spot, it doesn't move. Even though it did shift, it didn't move from its original position. So now that we know the definition of the ball moving, let's talk about accidental movement. So in general, if the player causes the ball to move with intent or without intent, they're going to get a one-stroke penalty. Now, in 2019, we did add, the USGA added a rule about accidental movement on the putting green. And what has confused a lot of people is that has been interpreted as anytime you move your ball by accident anywhere on the course, it's fine, you just put the ball back, no penalty. That's unfortunately not the case. So there are 3 exceptions to this first bullet point here, where if you move your ball accidentally, you're not going to get penalized. All right, the first one is accidental movement during search. So this is new as of 2019, January 1st. If you're looking for your ball and you haven't found it yet, and you kick it or move it, there's no penalty to you, and you can replace it. That used to be a rule if you were in a water hazard. Water hazards don't exist anymore, and your ball was moving in a water hazard, and you moved it around. You were able to put it back. But now, anytime you're searching for the ball and you haven't found it yet, and you move it, you can just replace it, no penalty. This is a really great change because, especially in tournament golf, players were very hesitant to really put a lot of effort into looking for their ball, because if they accidentally moved it, they would be penalized. So especially in professional tournaments where there's a lot of volunteers looking for the ball, you would see the tour player just stand off to the side and basically let everyone else look for them, because they didn't want to accidentally hit the ball and get penalized. But if a volunteer moves it, there's no penalty there, and the ball just gets replaced. So that's exception number one. Exception number two is accidental movement on the putting green. I talked about this earlier, but no matter what the player is doing, if the ball moves by accident on the putting green, there's no penalty, and it can be replaced, and the play just continues on. The last one is accidental movement elsewhere while applying a rule, and I'm going to get into what that means a little bit more, but these are the only instances where the ball moves by accident other than on the putting green, and the player does not get penalized. So examples of accidental movement while applying a rule. One would be in an instance where someone needs to mark their ball because their ball interferes with another player's play and they're not on the putting green yet. If they were to put a tee down and mark the ball and they drop the tee and it moves the ball a little bit, that was movement attributed to some sort of action that was allowed within the rules. So marking the ball to get it out of the way for another player is allowed within the rules. If you move it by accident while doing that, you're not going to be penalized. You would place the ball back at its original location. No penalty. Another example is when you're what we call restoring worsened conditions. So if your ball is in the fairway and it gets run over by a golf cart and now it's embedded, you're allowed to recreate the original lie. And in order to do that, you're going to need to touch the ball. Okay. So just another example where if there's a rule involved and you're doing something around your golf ball and something you do accidentally causes the ball to move in an action that's attributed to that rule, you're going to be fine. Okay. When in doubt, you can always ask for a rules official, or you can ask for your fellow competitor's opinion. If you don't know if you were allowed to move the ball back to its original location or not, you can always play two balls if it's stroke play and go right on from there. Grounding the club, another area that there was a change with the grounding the club rules, and there's a little bit of confusion with it at times, we noticed. So grounding the club is not an official definition or terminology within the rules of golf, but it's a term that we've all heard, and it's loosely defined as basically putting your club on the ground behind your ball before you hit. In the previous rules, so before 2019, you could not ground your club in the bunker or in a water hazard. Now, as of January 1st, 2019, you now are able to ground your club in a penalty area. So we've talked about penalty areas. Think without anything that has red or yellow paint to define it. You are now allowed to essentially treat your ball as if it's in the fairway. You can put your club right next to it. You can take a practice swing, hit the ground, and then proceed with your shot. Some people, just in the rulings that we've had to give, have interpreted that as you can now ground your club everywhere, which is not the case. You are still not permitted to ground the club in a bunker. So we'll get into what you specifically are not allowed to do in a bunker. The first thing is that you cannot touch the sand with your hand, rake, or the club to test the conditions. Okay, that I'll get into on the next slide one aspect where you can use the rake before you hit, but in general, you are supposed to leave the ball as it lies. Do not disturb the sand around the ball. You cannot touch the sand with your club, specifically right around the ball. We actually talk about a couple instances where you are able to touch the sand with your club, but relative to trying to hit the golf shot, when you walk up and put your club behind the ball, you're not allowed to touch the sand until you hit the ball. These are the instances, just examples of where you cannot touch the sand with your club around the ball, making a practice swing, and even making a backswing. So we've seen some rulings in the professional level where the camera actually picked up that sand moved a little bit when a player took the club back to start their swing. And we mentioned high-speed cameras, but that's more about the ball moving as opposed to disturbing sand. So they were able to pick up that the player had brushed the sand on the way back, and the player was subsequently penalized after that. Okay, so what are you allowed to do in the bunker? You can dig your feet in to take a stance. And this is one part of the golf course where you really have the ability to make sure you have firm footing and dig in a little bit. You can't do it excessively. You can't do what we call build a stance. So mound sand to get your feet higher, or excessively dig down underneath the surface of the sand. But you can definitely make sure that you have firm footing by twisting your feet in either direction before you hit the shot. You can smooth the sand for the care of the course. I mentioned this earlier with the rake. If there's footprints behind your ball that are not going to, let's say they're 10 feet behind the ball as you walk in, and you grab the rake and you just smooth those footprints, you're hitting the ball in the other direction. Your action of smoothing those footprints is not going to have any impact on your golf shot. You're just doing it for care of the course. So because it doesn't have any ability to improve your current lie or shot, that is going to be allowed. Now, you can't have footprints in front of your ball and you go rake them up and just say, hey, I was doing it for the care of the course, because that is, even though you might be caring for the course, it's still improving your line of play. So you need to make sure that it has no impact on your line of play or the lie of the ball or anything like that, and then it's just for the care of the course, and you're not going to get penalized. You can actually place clubs or equipment in the bunker. So if you walk into the bunker, you have 2 wedges, you're not sure which one you want to use, you take some time, you pick your 56 degree wedge, but you'll have your 60 in the bag. It's a big, or in your hand, and it's a big bunker. You can just toss that to the side, provided that it doesn't affect anything about the shot, and you're not going to get penalized there. Measuring, marking, lifting, replacing, or taking other actions under a rule. That's a big mouthful, but essentially what that means is, so let's say you had an unplayable lie in the bunker, and you wanted to take the option where you take 2 club lengths and drop there. Well, you need to measure your 2 club lengths to make sure you're taking the appropriate amount of relief. You would be allowed to measure and touch the sand with a club to make sure you get 2 club lengths, and then drop the ball in the bunker and then take your shot. So that's not considered grounding the club, because you're doing it while applying a rule. And lastly, you can lean on the club. You can actually lean on the rake too, if you're just want to stay balanced or you're trying to prevent a fall. So if you and the person you're playing with are both in the bunker, you're waiting for them to hit their shot, you're far enough away from your ball where you're not going to have any impact, and you can lean up on your club while you wait for that person to play. Loose impediments versus movable obstructions. this is getting back into the definitions part of the rule book. Just want to talk about what the distinct differences between these two terms. You may have heard of them, you may have not. The easiest way to remember is that loose impediments are natural things that we find on the golf course, and obstructions are man-made. Just some examples of a loose impediment would be stones, loose grass, leaves, branches, sticks, worms, insects, things that are naturally occurring that are loose, that they're not embedded, they're not growing, they're not attached to anything. That's the big key there. So grass clippings are a loose impediment, but grass growing from the ground is not. And then an obstruction or movable obstruction is a man-made object that can be moved easily. The definition says it's an obstruction that can be moved with reasonable effort and without damaging the obstruction or the course. And we'll see with these, there's a lot of similarities between these two things, but there's also some pretty important differences as well. They both can be moved anywhere on the golf course. This is new as of 2019. So it used to be if you were in, well, it was a water hazard, but if you were in a penalty area or a bunker, you could not move loose impediments. And you could move movable obstructions before, but loose impediments you could not. So in the picture I have here, you've got a pine cone next to the golf ball. That's a loose, naturally occurring object. It's a loose impediment, but you're in a bunker, so you can't move it. You just have to try and hit that shot with that pine cone there. Now, with the rule change January 1st of last year, you can now move that. The difference, though, with when you're moving loose impediments, you cannot cause the ball to move. Okay, so it doesn't matter where you are on the course. If you're moving a loose impediment, so a pine cone, pine straw, sticks, and your ball moves, you're now in breach of a rule. You have to replace the ball and apply a one-stroke penalty. Also, you can't deliberately move a loose impediment while a ball is in motion. So an example of that would be, I've hit my ball up a slope and it's rolling back towards me, and there's a couple pine cones that I think the ball might deflect the ball, and I grab those and throw those out of the way while the ball is in motion. That's not allowed. I'm now in breach of a rule. But as long as you're not doing either of those two things, causing the ball to move or moving the loose impediments to avoid that deliberate deflection, you can move them to your heart's content. Obstructions are a little bit different. Again, a lot of similarities in terms of the fact that they're usually easy to move. But what we'll see here is that, excuse me, one key thing with obstructions is that if you're moving an obstruction and the ball moves, there's no penalty. You can replace the ball where it originally was. So that's the big difference between loose impediments and obstruction. So if it's a natural object, be really careful when you're moving things around your ball, because if the ball moves, you're going to get penalized. If it's man-made, so an example of that would be a tee or another person's golf ball that is not your partner or opponent in match play. That golf ball would be an obstruction. If you're moving that and your ball moves, you get basically, it's not really free relief, but you can put the ball back where it was for free. There's no penalty. The exceptions for that are if the tee marker of the hole being played. So we talked about the teeing area is only the teeing area for the hole being played. The tee markers in that teeing area they can't move. Those are not movable obstructions. Those are deemed to be fixed in place, even if you can easily move them. And then similar to loose impediments, you're also going to get penalized if you're moving a movable obstruction in order to avoid the ball hitting it in the air or while it's moving. The exceptions of deliberate movement are you can move the flag stick. So if you're on the putting green and someone's putting and the ball is rolling towards the flag stick that's lying on the ground, you can move that and there's no penalty. And equipment. So example of equipment would be someone's golf bag. You're able to move both of those. And then a ball at rest on the putting green. This is a change, actually. It used to be that if you putted and the ball was in motion and someone's ball was potentially in the way, you could not mark it. You had to just hope that it wouldn't hit. Now, if the ball is at rest on the putting green, you can throw a marker behind it and move it while that ball is in motion. All right, moving on to the flag stick. Another big change in January 1 of 2019 was that the flag stick is now allowed to be left in the hole while you're on the putting green. So in the old rules, if the flag was in the hole and your ball hit it when you had played from the putting green, it was a 2-stroke penalty. They have done away with that penalty, and the big key here is that if you want the flag to stay in the hole, you have to make that decision before you make your stroke. So you can't, after you hit the ball, you've hit it hard, you tell someone to leave it in the hole, even though the plan was for them to pull it. You're not allowed to do that. So you either have to have it in while the ball is going towards the hole or have it out. That may be a little confusing. I just want to clarify. You can still have the flag attended, and we'll talk about that right now. When the flag is attended, the attendant holds the flag in the hole while the player is putting, and then once the ball is in motion, pulls the flag. So that is still permissible within the rules. The person who is attending the flag has a couple responsibilities. One, it's important that they need to be authorized by the player to attend the flag. It could be the player can authorize anybody. It could be a fan standing there. It could be another player in the group. It could be the caddy. It could be anybody. And if someone's standing right next to the hole, right next to the flag stick, it's assumed that they've received authorization from the player. That the player doesn't verbally have to say, "You are authorized to attend the flag for me." And similar to the first bullet where the flag has to be left in the hole, the decision's already been made when someone's attending that flag that it's going to be pulled once the ball starts. So the player can't hit the ball and think it's going too fast and tell the attendant, leave it in. The attendant must remove the flag stick. If the ball accidentally strikes the flag stick or the person attending the flag, as long as they were authorized by the player, there's no penalty and you play the ball as it lies. Excuse me. Oh, sorry. If the ball is deliberately deflected, the player is going to be penalized. The only exception to that is if the person who moved the flag stick was not an authorized attendant. So I'll give an example. Say there's two people playing. One person, they're far away from each other. There was no discussion about tending the flag. The flag is just in the hole. And player A hits his putt or her putt towards the hole. Player B, without saying anything, runs over and yanks the flag out of the hole. Well, if player A had told player B to do that, then player A would have been penalized. But since player B just did it under their own decision-making, they were an unauthorized attendant, and the penalty does not apply to the player A who hit the ball. Teeing area. Talked about teeing area a little bit. Obviously, it's one of the 4 defined areas of the golf course. But there's some really special things about the teeing area that a player can't do in any other part of the course. They're allowed to do a lot more in terms of improving the area than they can in other areas. So on the diagram on the right side here, it just shows you just a nice diagram of the defined area that a teeing area is. So you can see that the 2 tee markers up top there, those 2 squares, and the teeing area is defined as a rectangular space that's 2 club lengths behind the tee markers, okay? So you can go back as far as 2 club lengths when you're playing from the teeing area and your ball is still in the correct spot. If your ball, some of these examples are just showing balls that are not in the teeing area. So if it's too far forward, if it's ahead of the tee markers, it's not in the teeing area. If it's too far back, further than 2 club lengths, then it's outside of the teeing area. Certain improvements you're allowed to do within the teeing area that you can't do elsewhere. And we always are told and pounded into our heads, play the ball as it lies. The teeing area is one place where you do not have to do that. So you can actually alter the ground. Sometimes you'll see someone take on a par 3, they'll take an iron and they'll dig it into the ground to prop it up a little bit instead of using a tee. So that's allowed. You can actually move, bend, or break grass, weeds, or other natural things. So we talked about loose impediments and they need to be detached. The teeing area is one place where you could actually take pieces of grass or weeds and rip them out of the ground. Obviously, we don't recommend doing that, but if it's in your way, it's in your way, and you're not going to be penalized within the rules. You can also remove sand and soil. One thing I did not mention when we were talking about loose impediments was that sand and loose soil are not considered loose impediments. They can be removed in the teeing area and they can be removed on the putting green. But everywhere else, if it's just loose sand or soil, you have to leave it as is. You can also remove dew, frost, and water. So if you're playing early in the morning, there's a really thick layer of dew on the ground. But when you're in the teeing area, you could take a towel and you could pad that grass and dry that up, and you're allowed to do that. Last aspect of the teeing area, when the ball is located in it, it can always be moved and re-teed. So an example for that is I hit my tee shot, it hits a tree and it ricochets back and ends up in the teeing area again. I don't have to play it from where it ends up. I can pick that ball up, I can play it anywhere within that teeing area again, and I can actually put it on a tee. Hopefully this scenario doesn't happen to you. Hopefully when you play one shot from the teeing area, you're out of it and you're on into the fairway or onto the green. But just kind of an interesting aspect of the teeing area. As long as it's the teeing area of the hole being played, you can pick it up and move it around and tee it back up as long as you're staying within that defined area. Right. Improvements allowed on the putting green. This is also as part of the big rules change in January 1st of last year. I just mentioned on the previous slide that you can remove sand and loose soil on the putting green, whereas you can't do it in the general area or in penalty areas or bunkers, but you can do it on the teeing area and the putting green. You can now repair damage. So damage, some examples of damage would be a ball mark, shoe damage, spike marks. That's a big change. Whereas before you could not fix spike marks. I think that's a really nice positive there. And the only stipulation is that you can only repair the damage using a hand, foot, divot tool, tee, club, or something similar. So you can't pull a shovel out of your golf bag and fix spike marks. You have to use something that's a normal golf equipment that you have right there. And when you're repairing damage, you can't delay play. So it needs to be something that's a quick, simple fix, and you can do it with the equipment you have with you that's golf related. Now, certain things that happen to the putting green are not considered damage under this rule. So it doesn't include anything resulting from normal maintenance practices. So the picture here is aeration plugs. You are not able to take your divot tool out and fix that like you would a ball mark. Any damage that results from irrigation or rain, you're not allowed to fix. Natural surface imperfections. So an example of that would be weeds, right? That's a surface imperfection coming up out of the ground. You're not able to remove that at all. And then lastly, natural wear of the hole. So if someone hits a shot from a far distance and it lands on the edge of the hole and messes up the cup, you can fix that because that's damage that's not natural wear of the hole. But throughout the day, what you'll see is little sorts of imperfections around the cup. If the cup hasn't been changed for a few days, it won't have that nice sharp edge. So that's just happening slowly over time. You're not able to fix that. Looks like we have a question.
What if you tee up outside the teeing area? Is there a penalty? If so, what is the match play?
Okay, great question. So the question is, if you start the hole from outside the teeing area, what is the penalty, or is there a penalty? We're gonna break it up into stroke play and match play because the answer is not the same for both. In stroke play, if you hit your first shot from outside the teeing area, you are not considered to have started that hole yet. So you're gonna be, it's a 2-stroke penalty, and any shots that you hit with that ball don't count. So say I hit outside the teeing area. Let's use an example that there's 2 different sets of tees on the same tee box, and I tee up from the wrong set of tee markers. I'm outside that teeing area. I hit my second shot. I walk up to my second shot. I hit that, and then someone makes me aware that I teed off from the wrong set of tees. I've hit 2 shots from outside the teeing area. They do not count towards my score, but I must go back to the correct teeing area and correct my mistake. And I'm going to be hitting my 3rd shot there because it's 2 penalty strokes, and then I'm making a stroke from the teeing area. Okay. If you do not correct that mistake before you tee off the next hole, you're disqualified. So it's in stroke play, they take it very seriously. You need to make sure that you're within the teeing area when you're starting the hole. In match play, if you hit your ball from outside the teeing area, there's no penalty, but your opponent has the option to make you cancel and replay the shot. So let's say you had your ball a little ahead of the tee markers and you just absolutely crushed one down the middle. Your opponent can make you aware that you're outside the teeing area and that shot's canceled and you have to hit another one. On the flip side of that, you could be outside the teeing area and you could duck hook it into the woods, and your opponent just says that's on you, and now you have to go find your ball and play it from there. So really, it's kind of the neat thing about match play is the rule is not as penalizing because you don't have that disqualification penalty at the end if you don't fix your mistake. But there's some strategy there where your opponent has an option to make you replay or not. It's a great question. All right. Our last topic here is cleaning the golf ball. So there's several opportunities where there's a lot of opportunities where you can clean your ball while you're playing during the play of a hole, but we're going to talk about some specific times when you're not allowed to do that. Now, anytime you lift your ball from the putting green, you can clean it. There doesn't have to be any sort of special stipulations. If your ball's on the putting green, you can mark it, pick it up, and clean it. These are the times when your ball is off the putting green. You have to mark it for some reason and pick it up, but cleaning is not permitted. The first is to see if it's cut or cracked. There's a rule about determining if your ball is unfit for play. This rule really doesn't come into effect a whole lot with modern technology. The golf balls stand up, after being hit many, many times. But occasionally, really, you you have an old ball and you really skull it across the green, or something happens and the ball is physically damaged, the player has to determine that it is actually damaged before switching balls. And in order to do that, they can mark it and inspect the ball to see if it's cut or cracked. They just can't clean it. If it's not cut or cracked, they're not able to clean it. They have to put it back. Next is to identify it. Player always has the right to identify their ball, because it's very penal, especially or in both forms, stroke play and match play, if you play the wrong ball. In stroke play, it's a 2-stroke penalty, and in match play, it's an automatic loss of hole. So we want to make sure that the player has the opportunity to identify their ball. Let's say it's buried in the sand and they can only see a couple dimples, and they want to make sure that it's theirs. They can mark it, pick it up, see if it has the mark that they've put on at the beginning of the round, confirm that it's theirs, and then recreate that lie, and they can't clean the ball. This is if it interferes with play not on the putting green. So Chris and I are playing. His ball is a little bit behind mine. We're up near the green, so we're going to be chipping. The ball is going to be close to the ground, and my ball is a couple yards ahead of his, and he wants to hit a low running shot. Well, my ball could very well interfere with his play. So he can ask me to mark it, and I cannot clean it when I do that because I'm not on the putting green yet. So what we tell people to do is hold the ball with 2 fingers and just keep it out of your pocket, hold it off to the side, just so there's no chance that you accidentally clean it. Lastly, when you're trying to see if your ball lies in a condition where relief is allowed, an example I'll give is checking to see if your ball is embedded in the ground. If your ball is embedded, you get free relief from that pitch mark, but it's not always clear whether your ball is embedded or not. So you're able to mark your ball and then lift it to see if it is embedded and resting in its own pitch mark. When you're doing that inspection, if the ball is not embedded, you're not able to clean the ball. You have to just replace it back. So this is another time where if you find out that it is embedded and you are going to get relief, you can clean it at that time. Just like if you're trying to see if your ball is cut or cracked, if it turns out it is, you can swap out another ball. But in the inspection process to see if your ball is embedded, you're not allowed to clean it. If the player cleans a lifted ball when not allowed, he or she gets a 1-stroke penalty. And a ball lifted from the putting green, I mentioned this earlier, can always be cleaned. That is all the information we have for you tonight. If I can give you any sort of takeaways, one is always take into account what format you're playing. Because as we've talked about with playing outside the teeing area, the rules are very different for match play versus stroke play. So always make sure that you're taking that into account when you're determining the ruling that you're making. Secondly, definitions are really important to understand, like the definition of a penalty area versus a bunker and the things you're allowed to do in the penalty area that you're not allowed to do in a bunker. So the terminology is very important. Teeing area is another one I talked about a lot, but it's a very specific, it's not the tee box. The tee box is just a general part of the golf course, where the teeing area is a very specifically defined rectangular box, and there's a lot of special privileges you have being in the teeing area that you don't have in other places. So the terminology is very important. And then lastly, always make sure that, especially in a tournament setting with a stroke play, if you're really not sure what the correct ruling is, you can always play a second golf ball. And if there's a doubt to your procedure, and you can check afterwards. In match play, you can't do that, unfortunately. And if you and your opponent don't agree on the ruling, your opponent can always make a claim that they think if the ruling is something else. And then once you come across a rules official, you can get a ruling there. But in stroke play, really encourage people who are in kind of a sticky rule situation and they're not exactly sure what to do to always play that second ball and make sure you identify which ball you want to count. And then when you get to the scores table, go through the scenario with the person at the table, and we'll give you a ruling then. Thank you so much. If you have any questions offline, my email address, jmills@ccclub.org. Happy to answer any rules questions. Or if you were in for the handicap seminar last week, if you have questions that came up from that, please let us know. Thank you so much for tuning in. We have another Congressional Academy live on Thursday. Jason Epstein's covering back to basics, talking about fundamentals in the golf game, and that is at 6 o'clock. Have a great night and take care.